Hello, and thank you for joining us for another episode of the UNspecial podcast. We are a space for parents to come be heard, supported, equipped, and inspired. We're not here to tell you what to do with your child or present the latest therapies and behavior modifications. We are simply here for you. Our hope, our goal is for all parents to be in community with one another and in community with us at UNspecial. So thank you for joining us.
I work with student teachers now. One of the things that I really preach is to stay humble and learn the lessons where you can, because you don't know which lessons you need to learn, and you don't know which ones are going to end up being the most impactful until, you get on the other end of things. So keeping an open mind and really hearing people out.
Yeah, and so that was my third year teaching, and we were thrown on a campus that hadn't had a life skills class, and middle school probably wasn't my jam, mixed with being on a new campus, mixed with maybe the demographic, a lot of things. But I remember I didn't hear many of the stuff that was going on behind the scenes, because we would meet a lot, but you would always encourage me and just tell me, essentially, just keep going, just keep doing, and we'll adapt things here and there. And obviously there was a frustrating year. And that's kind of when this idea for UNspecial, this podcast, came about, is sitting through all those IEP meetings and the lawyers and everything going on. I just really saw the struggle parents have. And I remember thinking, like, is there anything for these parents? Are any of them like doing this together? I know that year there was a group of parents, but as a general, from my 7 years teaching, I didn't see any kind of community for parents. And so that's kind of our whole goal with UNspecial. But yeah, so on the show today, we have a amazing educator, administrator, special ed guru, been around for years. And I think the best way to describe Robin, I heard an analogy recently, and the context of the analogy was when you're going through hardship and trial and just suffering in life. But I think that this will relate to you. So there's three. If you had a pot of boiling water and you put in a carrot, what happens to the carrot? It just becomes soft. If you put in an egg, it becomes soft on the outside, and then the yolk becomes hard. But if you put in a coffee bean, the coffee bean is the change catalyst for all the water around it. And I would say your career in special ed, you have been that coffee bean. You've been that change. And I mean, I saw it for a year, and you've been in special ed for how many years?
Special ed about 22 or so.
And burnout is real. Special ed teaching is not a walk in the park. Like you said, it takes a special person. But I think it's been cool to see how you've been that change catalyst. So with that intro, welcome to the show, Robin.
Thank you.
So take me back through your career, like the early days. When did you get started? What brought you in and kept you around?
I always laugh when people ask, why, what made you want to do this? Because I honestly, I don't know. It was a calling. It's all I ever remember wanting to do. I didn't grow up in a family where college was even mentioned. Like my parents, that was not their background. I think they were all just fingers crossed that we would even finish high school. So I always wanted to be a teacher. I talked about it in high school. I took a class, they called it cadet teaching, where you got to go to one of the elementary schools and be like an aide for a couple hours a day, which I loved. I tutored some of those kids that were struggling, in my free time, but never considered going to college. It was just not even a conversation. So I followed my mom and became an office worker and got married young, had kids young, and always volunteered in whatever way I could in schools. I'm working with kids. And my husband finally at one point said, God, why don't you just go get a credential already? Like, this is ridiculous. It had honestly never occurred to me up to that point to do that. I had been an aide for a couple of years, and I don't know, so we bit the bullet. I went to National University and paid a ton of money because I was a grown up with kids, and, I needed to be able to do it part-time. I couldn't go We didn't have Cal State San Marcos down the road then. I would have had to go all the way to San Diego. We lived in San Marcos. So went to national, worked really, really hard nights and weekends to go through nationals program and get a credential.
That's where I got mine.
When I graduated in 1990, there were no jobs, none. They would do these job fairs where they'd have 10 districts and, 3 districts would have an opening and there would be 1,000 people lined up outside the door to go chat up these folks to try to make an impression to get a job. So I had been an aide in San Marcos and I took a part-time job in San Marcos as a reading specialist in 1990 and did that for 2 years before I could get hired full-time. And I got hired up in Murrieta when Murrieta was expanding like crazy. I taught a K-1 combo where I had to switch classrooms in the middle of the day in gen ed, because at that point I only had the gen ed credential. I knew always that I wanted to teach special ed, but back then you had to get the gen ed credential first. And then you could enroll in a SPED program. And all of the people that I knew and trusted said, stay with gen ed for a bit and figure out gen ed first, and then get your special ed. So as part of pursuing my master's and clearing that preliminary credential, I did that. I went for special ed then. So I taught general ed longer than I had originally intended to, about 7 years, I think it was, in 2 different districts. And the last year, I was in the Escondido Union Elementary School District. And I was always the gen ed teacher that had all the kids mainstreaming. I welcomed everybody from special ed into my classroom because it was a great experience for me and I loved it. So before my last year in gen ed, I went to the SPED director in Escondido, who was Claudia Boyle at that time, and said, I want to teach special ed. And back then we didn't have an internship per se kind of program, which we have now here in California, but we had this emergency credential thing. And she said, you don't have the credential. It was truly about money. If you got into a position where you had to earn the credential in order to keep your position, you could write it off on your taxes. So I chose to do it that way rather than get the credential first and then go get the SPED job. I got the SPED job first. So I went to Claudia and said, I want to go to SPED. And she said, I don't have a shortage in mild moderate. Would you consider going to mod severe? And I said, I don't know. Sure, I'll give it a shot.
Yeah.
So, because they can only put an emergency credential if you were in a teacher shortage area. So during the coursework for my SPED credential, a guest lecturer came into a class, and she was a teacher in Oceanside who had a designated autism program. And she talked about some of the strategies that she used in her program. And I was hooked, absolutely hooked. I was like, oh my God, this sounds so cool. I totally get these people. I need to know more. So I read everything I could get. And when I met with Claudia, she said, what could you see yourself doing? And I said, I love all things autism. And I might also like to think about working with kids with severe emotional needs. So you can see like her eyes light up, like, what are you in the district for a bit? She knew me from my mainstreaming and all of that. So yeah. So that last year that I was in gen ed, they mentored me. They took me to trainings. I had one of the program specialists who had been the autism teacher and was like famous for everything she knew about autism, because she'd been involved in working with kids with autism before we even called it autism. So she mentored me the last year I was in general ed to get ready to move to the autism program the following year. So I had a lot of really amazing support when I moved to that program. I had experienced aides who laughed at me behind my back because there was so much I didn't know, but I loved it. And, we were talking earlier about just being so curious about what make kids tick. That was it for me. I love trying to solve the riddle of what was that about?
Yeah.
And fortunately, I worked with aides who were also curious about that. So they were generous with their time. We didn't have planning time together back then. Now we have a little bit of that built into the schedules, but my aides would stay late or come early and we could just sit at the end of a day and go, what the heck happened there?
Yeah.
Like, what did you think? So yeah. So I did that. I taught an autism specific self-contained special day class for kids with really significant autism. So back in the beginning, they were all nonverbal. They were high behavior because that was the only tool they had for communication.
Okay.
It was the dark ages in so many ways. We did have IEPs, so at least we had that structure, but we had no curriculum. We had no evidence base of what practices really work other than discrete trial training, which was something that was done in a clinic. It wasn't something we could immediately replicate in schools, though we did try. Board Maker was a bunch of pictures in a book. Like you couldn't just
Oh, wow.
got icons, the way we do now. So that was, it really was just figure it out. And it was figure it out every single day. Every single day was, what do I do next? And I was lucky that I was curious because I stumbled into things that worked. So yeah. And then I got to a point where, I was 33 when I earned my original credential. I was a full-fledged adult. My kids were in middle school and high school. So physically, teaching in a mod severe class with kids with high behaviors was starting to wear on me after
Yeah.
7 or 8 years. And administrators had said to me many times throughout the years, like, don't you want to become an administrator? Don't you want to come and be a special ed program specialist? And the way Escondido uses their program specialist wasn't something that appealed to me, but I started doing research. I'd spent about half to 3/4 of a school year being an autism specialist, where I went into classrooms to try to help those gen ed teachers support their kids. And I didn't love that job because there was no teeth. You couldn't make anybody do anything. I could go in and tell them over and over the same things, add structure, add visuals, and they would not do it. And then, cry to me a month later. So I felt really ineffective. And like I was wasting my time. So I started just sort of looking around and found the Nixie SELPA's website. Escondido is not in that SELPA. So I had no familiarity, but they had,
What's SELPA real quick?
Special Education Local Plan Agency. So at least in California, I don't know if it's nationwide because I've only taught here. Districts lie within a SELPA, and a SELPA pools resources typically to support districts in lots of different ways with special education support. So at that time, the Nixie SELPA employed most of the program specialists for all of the districts. They owned those folks and they dispatched them to the different districts based on need. But what spoke to me on their website was they offered hundreds of trainings for teachers and parents, hundreds every year. And they had a full-time parent liaison. And that just felt like people who thought about this the same way I did. Like, we're all in this together. There's information to be had. We need to support each other. It just felt much warmer and fuzzier than I had been feeling. So I applied and was completely shocked when I got the job. And honestly, it was my autism experience. They wanted someone who had good background in autism. I had been really fortunate that Escondido had me trained in all of the cutting edge stuff. I got trained in the PECS communication system by the guy that invented it. Like endless trainings. So I appreciate and thank Escondido every day that they did that because it made me highly marketable, but it also made...
They were really good about sending, anytime I presented a training I wanted to go, like, see ya.
Yeah. So I can remember when I interviewed at the SELPA, there were, I don't know, 7 or 8 directors on the interview panel from the different districts within the Nixie SELPA. And one of the questions was, explain your experience in due process cases. And I had to be honest. Like, I don't have any experience with due process. I have no idea really how it works. But I figure if I get a job as a program specialist, someone will tell me and I can certainly research it. And one of the directors said to me, how have you taught autism specific classroom for 7 years and never had a due process case? And it was like, okay, I got them.
Yeah.
And I told them, by listening, like it wasn't all good. I made a lot of people angry. I disappointed a lot of parents, and those are the folks who've taught me the most for sure. But trying to listen, trying to understand, because I had been a parent for a long time before I became a teacher. So I had that background to work from that, we got to work together in this. And ultimately, I'm going to have your kid in my classroom a maximum of 3 years. You're going to have that kid forever. So I need to listen to you, not the other way around. So I fought that attitude in a lot of other people, related service providers, even my classroom aides, as good as they were, really felt like we were the experts. It's like, well, we're only the experts in what's happening in our classroom. We're not the experts in the kid. By no stretch are we the expert in the kid as a whole. So, yeah. So I brought that experience and that attitude with me as a program specialist. And there were times when that was difficult because, like, I don't like setting time limits for IEP meetings. I think we need to listen to what parents have to say, and we need to allow adequate time to really explain, particularly at an initial,
Mhm.
what everything means, what every box in the IEP means. Like, that takes hours. If it takes 3 different meetings, so be it. I'm okay with that. And there are a lot of districts that don't want to do business that way. But I feel like the more we can front load that stuff, the better it's going to be for everybody.
Mhm.
And really the closer we'll be to the actual target of what we're supposed to be doing.
Yeah. And then you went from SELPA to program specialist, correct?
Yeah, well, I was program specialist for the SELPA for 12 years, which is technically the County Office of Education is really who employs you if you work for the SELPA. And they offered a retirement incentive. So I took the retirement incentive from the county, but kept working in the district. So I could no longer work for the county because I'd retired from there, but I could continue working in the school districts, which is what I did. I got hired in the district that we worked in together. And yeah, so I was program specialist the first year, coordinator the second year, and then I retired.
And now you train teachers.
Now I train teachers. I
That's
started that
fun.
the year that I was coordinator in the district. I started doing the university supervisor thing because I needed a way to transition out of a job that was, 24/7 to retirement. Like, that was too big of a jump for me. And I needed to stay connected. I just, like I said, it was sort of a calling for me. I feel like this is why I'm here, is to do good things for kids. And so I wasn't ready to stop doing that. And the university work it's fulfilling when it goes well. It's a lot more paperwork than I'd like it to be, but working with the candidates and seeing the candidates grow is just so awesome. And then being able, because I'm still pretty connected in a lot of the districts, people that I've been with are directors in districts. And so when I have good candidates, I help them get hired. Not that they need help at this point because they all get multiple offers, but it really is, it's fun. That part of it is fun. The paperwork, not so much. But that's special ed in a nutshell.
Right. That's why everyone bails on special ed, all the paperwork.
We go in meetings. Nobody became a teacher to attend meetings.
No, no.
When you're dragged through 17 meetings in a school year for the same student, it wears on you.
I mean, I think we had like, how many weeks are there in a school year? 36, 40? We
Something like
probably had,
4, I think.
we probably had 30 IEPs.
At least. Yeah, at least. It was a lot. And that was a tough year for me. In that was a new territory for me. I'd never worked in that area before. I'd never worked in a high school. Well, yes, I had worked in a high school only district, but I wanted so badly to bond with some of those folks that had come from that feeder district because I'd also worked in that feeder district the previous year. So I felt like, okay, this should be easy. We should be buddies. And that was not the way it went. I upset 2 of those parents tremendously, and it that haunts me still. In both of those cases, though, it was an interpersonal thing between the adults because I wasn't able to share all the information. That's one of the difficulties about being a program specialist or a special ed administrator is there's lots of things you can't share with parents. So even when you are doing the right thing for their kid, you may not be able to explain how you got there completely or what have you. So in both of those instances, I managed to get their child into a program that fit better than the one they had transitioned into initially. But in the process of doing that, I upset one of the parents terribly, just chose to use the wrong word in a conversation and hurt her feelings. And the other parent, we just never could bond. And I wanted so badly to bond with that parent because that parent had multiple kids on the autism spectrum and a really full plate. And I wanted so badly to be a resource for that parent. And only now in hindsight can I look back and realize that isn't what she needed from me. And I was too blind to see that. I think I was more interested in what I needed rather than what she needed. So another lesson, hard
Yeah,
learned.
I mean, there was a ton of lessons from that year, which I carried on to the next year. And that when I went to transition, that was a blast. I didn't want to leave. We just moved. And that was right when I moved to the new building. And I was going to have an ocean view room. And then I moved to Idaho and I was in a class in the middle of the building with no windows. And 6 months out of the year, it's dark and gray and snowing. I remember sitting there like, oh my gosh, I could be looking at the ocean right now.
Yeah, and you're such an ocean guy. Like, yeah, that would be, yeah. Yeah, I loved, so in the course of my career as a program specialist and overlapping somewhat with my time as a teacher, I had the good fortune to work both with incoming children, so children aging in at age 3 who'd already been identified for services by someone else, either the Hope Infant Program or the regional center, because we have that here. And then as they're transitioning into school aged supports, which is a really hard transition for parents. And I loved being part of that and trying to pave that way and just be that emotional support for parents as they make that transition because it's a really, really scary time. And my other favorite part was that adult transition and the
Yeah.
visiting services. And I had 2 or 3 students over the course of my career where I worked with them as young children in some capacity. And then I got to see them in adult transition.
Yeah.
So that was really fun to see the full circle and to really get sort of an eagle level view of what their own trajectory looked like. Like, would I have predicted that this kiddo would have ended up doing all these things as a 22-year-old? And in all cases, no. So it really was another aha moment for, hey, we don't know what we don't know. And
Hmm.
anything that says they know what your 3-year-old is going to be like as a 22-year-old is wrong because
Right.
it doesn't matter how much experience you have. I probably worked with hundreds of kids on the autism spectrum, but I'm humble enough now to realize I could not forecast that for anybody. I mean, so my second or third year as a program specialist, we had a grandchild who born to us who was on the autism spectrum and was initially, it appeared quite severe, nonverbal, not a lot of behaviors, just a really mellow kid, really struggled and eventually got qualified for services, preschool age, and then transitioned in at age 3. And that kiddo is now 14, fully in gen ed, passing all the classes,
Whoa.
sports, and no one currently, very few people even know he has a disability at all.
Wow.
So again, would I have forecast that at age 3, 4, 5? No, not even,
That's
you know,
that's awesome. What how did he get to that point?
It's interesting. I'd like to say that I provided a lot of support, but it wasn't me at all. And in fact, at times I didn't agree with some of the strategies that are some of the choices maybe that the parents were making. So that's been an interesting journey as well.
Yeah.
Because as a grandparent, you get to be part of their life, but you don't get to direct anything really. So I try to be a support. I attend the IEP meetings, but honestly, I think it was just the kid. He never did look autistic to me as a youngster, or at least not prior to his diagnosis. I knew something wasn't right, but I didn't necessarily see autism. So he's always been one of those kids that was kind of spectrumy, but not necessarily full on. So I think that he had strengths, and some of those strengths were part of what made him not look so autistic. So always very social, very socially motivated, loved spending time with other kids. And all of what he learned when he was little, he learned from his siblings and the neighborhood friends. So we realized pretty early that that was an important thing for him. So I think that strength has really, really benefited him. And then recognizing it and feeding it and um, just always keeping him fully attached was the biggest thing. But he also received, in-home ABA therapy, speech therapy, occupational therapy, behavior therapy. He received all of those things. And over the course of my career, we didn't really have early intervention when I started teaching autism. And that's why it's not teaching autism, but you get what I mean? That's why so many of the kids were really at that severe level. But as just in the 20 years that I've worked with students with autism, early intervention has become widespread. And most kids get identified early. and get early intervention. And that has changed the way our special ed classes look. We don't have many kids in that really nonverbal, severe, behaviorally focused kind of situation anymore. We're much more in a more moderate range for most of the students on the spectrum. And most of the autism classes or classes that have a high number of students with autism in them just look very different from the classroom that I taught.
Yeah.
They have some verbal ability. They have the ability to follow directions. They're able to engage and learn academics at a level that my students just weren't able to do. And I was sort of reflecting on this the other day, that lack, in the autism community, we think of it as a window of opportunity. And that if you don't get that early intervention early, if it doesn't come until later, it's not as impactful. And that has certainly been my experience in just looking back at the students I had early on compared to the students even now that I see, I'm in classrooms all the time as a university supervisor. So even seeing the difference now, it's just like that early intervention is really, really impactful. That it's changed everything.
Yeah. I mean, you bring up a good point with early intervention, because I know there's got to be a handful of parents. I don't know if your experience with your kids of a denial phase, like, no, there's nothing wrong with him. This
Mhm.
is how he is. I just started watching a show on Netflix called Mothers of Penguins, and it's very interesting. There's only 6 episodes, but it's about a mom who has a kid with autism, but she's in denial and doesn't want to believe it. And he's getting all these resources provided to him, but she's shutting them all down because she doesn't want to come to terms with he's just a little bit more unique than his peers. But in a sense, you're kind of, which I hope this doesn't come across the wrong way, but it's kind of like you're not providing him everything he needs to be successful because of that denial. Have you experienced that a lot in your career with parents?
Yeah, there are, yes, multiple times, and there are so many good reasons for it. So I try, and when I work with teachers, I don't like judgment as a teacher to begin with. So I'm always kind of battling that when I work with young teachers or as a program specialist when I was supporting teachers. And one of the things that I've always told teachers that I work with is part of our job is educating parents. It's not just educating the kids. Part of our job is to educate the parents because this is new for them. We do have a lot of training and background. So we are expert in all things special ed in theory, but most parents didn't experience special education firsthand when they were in school. So the model is very foreign to them. I once had a parent tell me with those early intervention programs in particular, because they're typically provided in your home, that this is a very invasive way to to raise your child because you have people in your home. So you have this, for a lot of families, this feeling like, oh God, I've got to clean my house because the ABA people are coming today. And just all the different things that it just invades your personal life and your private life. You have people in your home 3 days a week.
Mm-hmm.
Oh,
Oh,
that's huge. And you don't necessarily know what it is they're doing. So lots of times they're working in another room, or, at least now with so many of us working online, you're not even necessarily involved. Or like in our family's case, the grandparents were all doing the daycare. So we were the ones who were there while ABA was in the home, and that kiddo's parents were off at work. So we were the ones observing what was happening and we were reporting, but the parents really didn't get to have the firsthand knowledge. So it's a very awkward kind of situation. And then, at least here in California, prior to age 3, Regional Center provides the services, provides because they're contracting out to non-public agencies to provide in-home ABA and what have you. And then oftentimes they're billing your insurance because now insurance has to provide these supports. Post age 3, fewer kids get any kind of support through Regional Center because you have to be identified with one of 5 different disabling conditions. And Regional Center supports kids from birth to death for those 5 conditions. And one of those 5 conditions is autism. And the 5 conditions are based on that they are lifelong conditions that you can't outgrow. So it gets complicated once kids hit age 3. They have to have a diagnosis. Regional center is still required to provide support if needed, but now the school district is responsible primarily. So you have the school district providing maybe a preschool, a special ed preschool experience, speech therapy, occupational therapy. You might also have regional center recommending in-home therapies, but your insurance is now required to provide it. And so they're the ones contracting with these agencies. So everything gets very complicated for the parents to manage.
Mm-hmm.
Also, here, I've seen a lot of times where there's a cultural difference. So we have some folks, I've been in districts with Indian reservations, Native American Indian reservations in their territories.
You made me think of one of the students from the year we worked together. Chicken nuggets.
So you sometimes just have culture where we don't welcome outsiders into our communities and into our homes. And our culture is that we take care of our own. And so in the district, one of the districts that I worked in, we would often not see these kiddos until they were 5 coming into kinder. And they would have had no intervention whatsoever. And they could be very, very impacted by their autism. And so, or whatever, their other specialties.
Yeah.
I had a family completely other end of the spectrum, a family with a kiddo with significant disability and a lot of medical needs who chose not to pursue school-based services. They had in-home services, but when the child became school age, they chose not to engage with the school district. Their kiddo attended a private Montessori school. Their older children attended the same Montessori school, and the Montessori school was doing right as far as they were concerned for their kiddo, and they saw no need to make a change. So at least that kiddo was getting services.
Yeah. Well, you bring up two core values that we have at UNspecial is the parent is the expert. And I don't think they realize that, and I don't think they're told that enough. But they know their child the best. I mean, we get them for 2, 3, 4 years, and we only know what we know. We don't know what happens at home. And so I think their voice in the IEP meeting is invaluable. And I hope that all parents can know that and speak up for what they need and they want. And then the other one is to educate parents, because they don't know what they don't know. And the special ed world, there's a ton of terms and labels and so forth. But yeah, it's our job to educate them and let them know what they can do to best support them. And in your in-home experiences, how did those go? Were they received well? What worked the best? What was the challenge? Because on the other side of all this is the emotions that are real. I mean, you're talking about somebody's child, and with them hearing from everybody that they're a little bit different, like I can only imagine. And then you go into their house and tell them how to parent their child.
And not even just how to parent their child, how to organize your home.
Yeah.
Because so much of it is around, structure. Like if you're talking about autism, visuals, if you're talking about medical interventions, it's all the things wrapped around in all of the medical treatments, medical equipment, all of that. Like you have to make sure that there are pathways if your kid is using a walker or in a wheelchair or what have you. So there is, we're bossing them around about, their entire lifestyle. So it was interesting as a program specialist, I was working with preschool and that transition, and I loved it. I loved being the first contact at the district. I've always been parent friendly because I was a parent first. So, but I did wonder why that age 3 transition was so difficult for so many parents and why they came in with kind of angry. And then when my grandson was diagnosed, his pediatrician was clueless and would not refer him for any kind of testing until he was age 2. So that was a battle that I had for almost a full year with my own kid about, you don't need to wait for the pediatrician. You can seek these assessments on your own. But they chose not to do that. And so he was fully 2.5 before he was assessed for any services. Well, that's when we start the transition process to school. So by the time he was qualified and they finally chose an agency, and an agency finally came out, and initially the agency has to establish rapport. They have to get to know your kid before they can start asking them to do things. He had barely begun services at 2 years, 9 months when it was time for the school district to do their assessment. And I can remember my son saying, why? Why do we have to start over? Like, we just did an assessment. Like, we
Uh,
spent months doing an assessment. Why do we have to begin again? Can't they just talk to each other? It was like, God, I'm so sorry, but no. Criteria for receiving support from the school is very different from the criteria for receiving support through California Regional Center. So yes, it requires a separate everything. So I finally understood why it was that those 3-year transitions were so awful for so many of the parents. They had just barely got started with their in-home. And now not only do we have to reassess this kiddo and they have to fill out all that paperwork again, now we're going to provide all those supports outside your home with your 3-year-old. And if you can't manage to drive your kiddo to special ed preschool, we're going to put your 3-year-old nonverbal child or medically fragile child on a school bus and send them receive support outside your home. Like, who's going to sign up for that?
yeah.
And yet we do, because it's the only option parents have. Regional Center can't provide support post age 3 unless there's a really significant reason. And for kids with high levels of autism, they do. But for most families, it's the special ed preschool program that we're offering you or nothing. So they take the special ed preschool program, even though they're terrified for their kids.
Mm-hmm.
So it's crazy. It's a crazy system, but I understand now why. What was your original question? In-home supports? Is that where we started from?
Yeah. Or what works? I mean, it's got to take a family that's willing, obviously, but
No, not so much. What's interesting to an extent, yes. But one of the things I've learned is that, kids are bright and kids will figure out the different environments that they're in. And as a program specialist, I would hear teachers say, the parents, they don't have any follow through at home. And so he's misbehaving in my classroom. Nope. Nope. One has nothing to do with the other. Trust me. This
uh,
kid knows the expectations in both environments, and this kid is responding to the environment he's in. So if you're having behaviors, something in your program's not working, it has nothing to do with home. He's smart enough to know the difference in every case. I've never had a kid that didn't have a different personality. And that's another takeaway that I don't think I understood as completely until I had my own experience with my own family member with special ed, is that kids are different at school than they are at home. And sometimes so different that it's like not the same kid.
whoa.
So it really, my first year in special ed, I had a little girl who wasn't on the autism spectrum per se, though my program was the most appropriate placement for her. She had brain damage. She'd had a stroke in utero and had brain damage because of it, and had a terrible accident at home where she got burned very badly. And so when she joined my program as a first grader, she had just spent a year in and out of the hospital getting skilled and whatnot.
Gosh.
This is a really hard time for the family. This mom was saying, she can do this. We're proposing goals for an IEP. She's like, why are you writing goals for that? My kid can do that. She's been able to do that for years. And I'm like, sure, mom. Okay, well, I like to have those words back because it's something I learned that, yes, very often they are doing different things at home than they are at school and vice versa. And so as a program specialist, I've learned that either direction can be true, that the kiddo is doing more at school than they are at home. And so parents feel like we're lying about their kids' abilities because we don't want to give more services or what have you,
Mm-hmm.
or the opposite of, you guys can't see all the good things about my kid. You can't see all the things my kid can do. Now that we have a kiddo in our family, when my grandson was assessed at age 3, the report looked nothing like the kid that we had. Absolutely nothing. He didn't make eye contact. He made eye contact at home with the family just fine. What I learned was he makes good eye contact with people he knows and loves and trusts. And he does not
Yeah.
contact to people he doesn't have those things with.
I mean, that's kind of normal, right?
So So different things like that. So now I err on the side of caution and assume that what the parent is telling us is 100% accurate. So how do we duplicate that? Let's ask questions. We don't ask enough questions ever. What are you doing at home to get your kid to do that? How is your kid doing that? What's the setup? What's it look like? Particularly for kids on the autism spectrum, some things are, habit. And so the geography of how you're sitting with your kid, where you're sitting with your kid, the words you say can be really impactful and can really change the outcome. But that's true for all kids, Again, it's that, what are your expectations? So
Yeah.
it's, if they know mom expects them to be able to take spaghetti noodles and make letters, uncooked spaghetti noodles to form letters, but we're asking them to do it with a pen and paper, it's a different situation and it's a different skill to some extent. So we got to listen and we got to ask questions.
Hmm.
In-home, lots of in-home therapies work. And I would say my recommendation, because at least for us, our journey, and for all the families that have been intimately involved enough to have interaction with their in-home support folks, because sometimes we do get to overlap. Getting that in-home support, getting it all dialed in, receiving it, that's hard. That is hard for the family. It's hard for the parents. And very often, at least for us, we felt like, gosh, we're not getting enough bang for our buck. Maybe we need to change agencies. With me in there nitpicking every little thing they did,
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, they're saying, oh my gosh, these people don't even know what they're doing. They're doing ABA therapy, which, I've got years and years and years of experience doing. And I'm like, they're doing it all wrong.
Right.
My recommendation to parents is try to stick with the agency you've got. Where I see the least impact of early intervention is when families have to keep changing providers. And sometimes it happens because your insurance changes and you don't have any control. They're not working with that agency. They only work with this agency or what have you. But work with your team as much as you can rather than just switching agencies, because then you lose momentum. That 3 weeks that they spend establishing rapport, all of that, it just, you lose the momentum and your kiddo doesn't get to benefit as much.
Right. Yeah, that consistency is huge. I remember, I think it was my second year, I had a student ask me, he's like, when are you going to leave?
Mm-hmm.
I'm like, I don't know. I'm here. It's my second year.
Got no
He's like,
plan.
yeah, he's like, You've already made it longer than the last 4 teachers I've had. So when are you going to leave? I remember hearing that. I'm like, man, that's hard. And then I ended up leaving after that second year. But that's what they're used to.
Absolutely. And I will tell you that has a definite impact, because I've seen it. I've seen kids who have absolutely learned, I'm not going to trust people in that school building because they come and they go and I can't count on them. Um, and all I have to do is be naughty enough and they'll send me away or they'll go away or what have you. And so that can become a really self-fulfilling prophecy and this wicked spiral for kids when they don't get that consistency. I think that's another sort of aha for me as a special ed administrator, was so many, probably the majority of the students with IEPs that we work with are looking for a relationship they can trust. And they won't give you their best. They can't give you their best until they trust you. And it takes longer and longer to trust you as the teacher, the more they get set aside, ignored, the teachers change, what have you. So it can be a real challenge to develop that trust. And I think for a lot of teachers, they don't understand that that's the barrier. The barrier is this kiddo doesn't trust you. And only when he trusts you and when he values your opinion of him will you get, the best that this kid can bring. I mean, if you're nervous, if you're in an environment where things are hard and you're nervous and you don't think the people like you can't bring your best. Like, how could you?
And even the students that can't express that they know what's going on, they fully know what's going on. And I think that's why I had good success in the autism program in Escondido, is in the violence, I felt like I loved it. Like I flourished under it and the students' behaviors got a lot better. Even though, and then I would have people ask, like, what are you doing? Other than the routine and consistency and all that stuff. It's just like, I know they know what they can feel my energy and just stay calm and have fun, which is, I think a lot of classrooms take things a lot way too seriously. I know you saw my class and how much fun I like to have. And the students respond to that and not just being so serious.
I think that there's a tone, right? There's a tone that gets set in every classroom.
Hmm.
And if the tone is one that's calm and accepting, well, then the kids are going to be more calm. They're going to be more themselves, and they're going to be able to tap into, their skills and demonstrate their skills better. I often in my private life end up helping families one way and another. And I work with a family right now who has a kiddo with some pretty big behaviors at school, less so at home, much less so at home. And a very young student. And absolutely like the epitome of, I don't trust you, so I'm not going to try hard for you because you're just going to send me away anyway. And trying to combat that is really, really tough. And this is, a very bright kid, very bright, very verbal. It's just his particular disability manifests itself as really challenging behaviors. And so it's it's a tough day every day. I think working with that student and trying to develop the trust with him. It's a work in progress right now. We'll see where we get to, but
Yeah.
and
I mean,
this
it's gotta be reassuring for parents when they do get a good teacher and they feel confident sending them to school and hanging out with that person all day. Like that's got to be the most peaceful thing ever.
it really is. And it was one of the things in the, I wasn't a special ed teacher that many years, 7 or 8, probably 8 or 9. But I had a few parents who really, really thought I was the bee's knees because their experience up to that point had been so negative.
Yeah.
Teachers not accepting, teachers, kids not placed in the right kind of program. So they're constantly being told all the wrong things their kid did, and they're not hearing much about what their kid did right. And then they get to a program like mine or like yours where there was a higher level of acceptance. And yeah, that's the disability talking. It's not your kid. It's just the disability. So that yeah, those folks often felt like I was magical, and it's like it's not magic. It's the least
Right.
you deserve. Like every kid deserves to be respected. Every parent deserves to be respected. Even the most difficult situations that I found myself in, particularly as an administrator, I can only think of one or two parents in all the years that I worked in special ed who really weren't fighting for what was right for their kid. They were fighting to fight, but the vast majority were operating from a place of fear. Were
Hmm.
operating from their belief about what they believed their kid needed. And we were all trying to do what was right for the kid. We just didn't agree on what was right. But we were all operating in a positive way, right? Just trying to do the right thing to help a kid thrive. I can work with those parents all day long, even if we don't agree. But we have to, as educators, we have to accept that that's what's happening. That parents are scared. They're not just fighting to fight. And it's okay for us to not agree on what the next step should be. And we should be able to work through that.
Hmm.
But, it's all about communication. And that's the hard part. That's the hardest thing of all.
Yeah. So what was it like when you said you were seeing some signs with your grandson and then getting the diagnosis? Did your son call you right away or how did that all unfold?
So I was always there. I
Yeah.
went to all the assessments. I was there to hear the results. I was, bless their hearts, they've not had a moment's peace. I've inserted my
Yeah.
all of it completely, and they've been wonderful to let me be a part of everything. It was terrifying, absolutely terrifying for them. My MO is to just do what's next,
Right.
So I didn't have an emotional grief process maybe the way their parents did or other
Yeah.
people would because of my background with autism. It was like, okay, I know what to do.
Right.
So when are we getting our first IEP? When are we getting our IFSB? When are we getting our services? That's how I respond to those kinds of stressful things. So, but we had conversations about, is he going to live with us forever? Is he going to be able to get married? just all of those makes me teary eyed. And there were
Yeah.
a couple of phone calls, from my son where he would ask those kinds of questions like, well, because he wanted to know, he wanted someone to predict the future.
Hmm.
He wanted to know what's he going to be able to do. And I had to just keep saying, I don't know. And no one does. So you can go ahead and ask other folks if you want to. But if anybody tells you they know, they're wrong. They don't. And for my daughter-in-law, it was much more, okay, what do I do now?
Okay.
What am I supposed to do? And that was something I learned early on in my career, talking to parents. For most families then, and to a great extent still now, you get a diagnosis from wherever, because autism is a medical diagnosis. And most of what we are working with in the mod severe realm are based on medical diagnoses. So some doctor or clinic or whoever somewhere, some specialist diagnoses your kid with something, and then maybe gives you a pamphlet, and off you go. And you literally fall off a cliff.
Yeah.
You just have to figure it out. So as much as we in education are having to do everything by trial and error, because kids are not widgets, you know, just because they have the same diagnosis or the same genetic anomaly or what have you, they're still unique individuals. And so there's no one right answer to anything in teaching. And so everything is trial and error. And that's multiplied a million times for parents.
Yeah.
How do you feed a kid with this diagnosis? How do you dress a kid? How do you support a kid? What does play look like? What does independence look like for my kid? How
Yeah.
independent can I expect this kid to be moment to moment to moment? So it's hard enough educationally, and we have a lot of guideposts, but parents much more so. So yeah,
Yeah.
it was scary. It was terrifying for my kids to figure out that they couldn't get answers and that they had to just trust a bunch of strangers to provide appropriate supports without having, fortunately they had me
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
to be able to say, yes, that's appropriate, or no, that's not, or I'd like to see you, do more of this or less of that or what have you. And I will tell you, since he's had school-based services, we haven't always agreed with what was being offered by the district. And we've worked through some of those challenges. And I will be the first one to admit that I sometimes get angry in those meetings. I'm not always nice, partly because I think of my background. So I have high expectations. I know what should be happening.
Totally.
But I also have a high level of appreciation for the folks who are getting it right and who are, taking the time. I think that's the hardest part, is that, firsthand, we don't have enough time in education to do things the way we know would be best every single time. It just isn't possible. We don't have the time. So having to be in a meeting where, maybe things aren't exactly the way they should be is frustrating from an administrator perspective, from a teacher's perspective, and 100 times worse from a parent.
It's interesting. The father's thoughts are like, what is this kid going to make of himself? And then the mom is like, well, what are we going to do now? It's like two
It's
human nature.
assuming that that's the case. I would say that my son is much more in denial than my daughter-in-law, and
Hmm.
that's worked out okay. That's worked
Yeah.
out actually pretty well because it gave us a nice balance. But when I was teaching initially, all my contact was with moms. Moms attended and signed IEPs. We saw very little of dads. So it was something that we developed. There were 2 or 3 classes, depending on the year, at my school site who were all autism specific, categorical SDC, self-contained programs for kids with autism. So we would do in the spring a barbecue and have the families come in the evening and put the dads in charge of the grill.
Perfect.
So we would hold it on the kindergarten playground so we could have everybody in a contained space. We would put the barbecues outside the playground so that the kids could get close to the fire or anything, because we had to worry about that. And we would just do everything we could to reach out to the dads early on. Might have been my first year in teaching kids with autism. I went to the big Autism Society convention, was here in San Diego. And so I got to go, and I sat in on a workshop for dads. And I had to ask, can I come in? Because it was all dads. And listening to the dads talk about the things that concerned them was gut wrenching
Oh, wow.
because they were concerned about all the same things moms were, but moms had like moms in the program bond with each other. They get to know each other. Their kids are in the same, are moving through school services together. And so they have folks to talk to, and they're more open with me as the teacher. I'm hearing more from them where the dads really didn't have an outlet for them.
Wow.
And there's so much more of your identity as a dad tied up in who your kid is. And then when your kid isn't going to be like everybody else's kid, you don't really have anybody to talk to. So
Mhm.
we tried really hard to reach out to dads and to involve dads at some level, um, to really try to help them understand. And so often moms are the ones doing a lot more of the custodial care. Moms are the ones with the job that can be rearranged to be there to do in-home, supports or what have you. So they just have more of a hands-on level of knowledge about the child. And I mean, that's true of typically developing kids, but it's amplified when you have a child with special needs. And marriages often don't survive. There's a much higher rate of divorce.
I think it's north of 80%. And that's typically, from what I've seen, the dad's piece.
Yeah, I mean, it's just hard to be on the same page.
Yeah. Yeah.
And the dads are so much more isolated in a lot of ways than the moms. And some of that is, that old Mars and Venus, men just are different than women in a lot of ways. It seems like fundamentally, at least at this point, maybe maybe without society, we wouldn't be so different, but we're taught our roles and all of that. And so that is the reality for most of us. And so it is when you have nothing in common and when you're on opposite sides of the fence about what your kid needs or how much of that work you're each doing, there are a lot of ways that it can really impact your marriage.
Yeah. What were some of the fears that you heard from the dads?
I can remember one dad who talked about, it made me emotional, being asked to leave church because of the noise their child was making.
Wow.
And this was a church they'd been in for many, many years and being asked to just either don't come or don't bring your child,
Oh my gosh.
which, it's just like, wait, what now? And then all of the subtle ways that most of us who aren't living it don't realize, people with children with special needs are dissed, if you will, or put on
Mhm.
the outside of the box. Somebody's showing photos of their daughter's wedding at work. You have a kid with significant needs, you're never going to be able to share that experience, or prom pictures, or first day on the job, or, you know all those milestones that your child may not have. If your kid's only 6 or 7, you have no idea whether or not your kiddo is going to have that. You may have a belief, that, oh, my kid's never going to be able to do that, or yeah, my kid will get there. The toll it took on their wives and not knowing how to mitigate that, because they're working for some of these families. If it's a single income family where the dad is the one who's working and mom is working in the home, very often the dads have these high pressure jobs where they're expected to work 60, 80 hours a week. So the pull of, I need to support my wife or I'm going to lose my wife and my kids, or I'm going to lose my job if I take too much time out, to support my wife or to attend an IEP meeting or what have you. So just being pulled in those different directions and all of it being very high stakes.
Yeah. And emotional.
Yeah.
It's like you just have to be on the same page and communicate, really.
It's interesting. I think that overall, one of the biggest difficulties about having a child with special needs is the how vulnerable you have to allow yourself to be as a parent with all the different adults that you interact with. Do I really want to tell you about the challenges I'm having in my home with my own kid? Heck no.
No.
Do I want to share
Right.
with you that, dad just moved out because he couldn't handle the challenges of the kid, or, what have you? Like, no, I don't want to have to tell you that. That's
Mhm.
private stuff. I was raised that whatever is happening in your house is private business and it's not something you share with other people in the world. And a lot of people are raised that way. So it feels really awful for a lot of people to be open and vulnerable. If we get the best bang for our buck, we get the best progress for a child in special ed when we work together and we all have complete knowledge of who this kid is and what their life is like. So it's hard. It's unnatural. And moms are better at being vulnerable a lot of the time than dads are.
True.
So that was certainly true in our case. I've had a few kids who had single dads for one reason or another. And that was interesting.
Yeah.
In those cases, those dads functioned in a much more feminine way, much more like a mom typically functions than the dads who were married and the wife was more the manager of all the things around the kiddo. So interesting.
Yeah. I can't even remember any of the dads really. I mean, they were always working.
Exactly. And we work, school occurs at the same time of day.
Right.
As
It makes sense.
yeah. So it does, there are fundamental reasons why it's hard for some people, and in this case, often the dads to be more involved in the school-based stuff or even the home,
Yeah.
because we're not typically doing in-home ABA therapy at 7 p.m. We do have some kids that receive therapy at 5, but typically not when dads are home.
Mm-hmm.
I
Well,
don't
we're
think my son ever saw an ABA therapy session.
really.
No, no.
What were some of the most impactful moments you had,
Oh my gosh, there are so many.
or any that you saw from an early age, and you stayed in touch with them?
Oh gosh, I had a little girl. There was a little girl. So when I got trained in Escondido to do ABA therapy, which we called discrete trial training, then there's some differences between discrete trial training and ABA, but foundationally they're very similar. So when I got trained to do discrete trial training, part of that training was videos of a little girl, a 3-year-old, who was a feisty little booger. Oh my goodness. Big blue eyes, curly hair. And they were just teaching her to sit in a chair because she would just refuse any request that you made of her. And she sort of go rigid and she would screech. But one of her favorite rewards were these little tubes full of gelatinous kind of stuff. And it had, glitter and whatnot in it. And so she would visually enjoy looking at that, visually stim on that.
Yeah.
So I go on to teach, and a few years in, maybe my 3rd year, she comes to our school, to our program, in the older class. I have the younger kids that year, and my partner teacher had the older kids, and they were having some real challenges. She was not someone who was fond of wearing clothing. So by then she was, like 10 years old, 9 or 10 years old.
They just want to be free.
And so, just to keep home life at all manageable, if she stripped at home, that was fine. Nobody cared, right? Because here's your paddle.
Yeah.
So when she would get at all escalated, anxious, angry, whatever, she would just strip right down. And she only ever wore a little t-shirt, shorts, never any underclothes, never anything else. But in preschool, she went to school in a bathing suit. So, we had made progress. Because I have the little kids, it was distracting, shall we say, to the older kids when she stripped. They would notice. And that was creepy and nobody liked it. So I said, let's move her over to my program. My kids are so young. They don't care about nakedness. It's fine. So I got to work directly with her for one school year and found absolutely zero success.
I have the same thing. I could not figure it out.
Tried so hard she had been somewhat trained to use the picture exchange communication system. So she would use the icons to request food, but nothing else. So
did you have one on there to request, like, change your clothes?
Change your clothes, lotion.
Nothing.
She loved to have her arms rubbed with lotion. She loved all things Disney princess. So we made her own little area, a little quiet area in the classroom, wallpaper, Disney princess. Like, we went all out We did full on, I had been trained in PECs at that point. And so we went full on, 2 adults to the one kid, intensive level 1 PECs training to sort of undo this bad learning that she'd had, to try to get her to request other things or tell us when she was upset rather than stripping her clothes off. Um, zero success. Zero success with this kid. Could not ever teach her a single thing that she could demonstrate she had mastered for me in that school year. She would still strip out on the playground. So we had learned if we just grabbed a hold, she would always lie on the ground and sort of thrash. And so I learned on the playground, if I just grabbed her t-shirt and shorts in one hand and held on and just kept saying, clothes stay on at school, clothes stay on at school. She at least couldn't strip out there on the playground. So that year goes on. She goes on to middle school. I feel like a complete failure. Then many years later, I am working in a high school only district as a program specialist. And I get a phone call from a different district saying, we have a kiddo who needs an adult transition program placement and she won't fit in our program. Would you consider taking her? I'm like, yeah, sure. Back in those days in that SELPA, we swapped kids all the time. Come to find out it's her. It's my little blue-eyed, curly-haired, wild thing who I loved, but never could figure out. I'm like, oh, this will be fun because our adult transition program is out in the community a fair bit. And I had no idea what was going to happen. And she could be aggressive, but she was aggressive sort of randomly. She would just sort of, you know, hit you closed fist without any warning because she was nonverbal. She didn't have any good way to really express herself. So I thought, oh, okay, well, this will be interesting out in the community. But you know what? By then, she could be out in the community. She still, every once in a great while, would haul off and sock somebody, but almost never. So she stayed with us 3 years. She exited at age 22. And I said, I want to be the admin for that meeting because I want to see this young lady transition out into adulthood and into a day program because I have seen her since she was 3 years old and aged in off and
Yeah.
on, and even got to teach her for 1 year. So that was really, really fun for me. I had a few in the district that we worked in together where I had been 2 or 3 of the students that were going through the high school program and then into the adult transition program, the 2 years that I was there, who I had aged in age 3 into their small feeder district. Back when
Yeah.
I was working with the little districts at the elementary level that were aging up into that high school district. So I got to see them at both ends, and the parents, it was like a whole week. Oh my God, it's you. Because, you spend a lot of time with those parents at that 3-year-old transition into school services. So it was fun for me to, again, see the beginning and the end and
Yeah.
how far those students had come, to see how different they were, to see the kinds of things they got interested in.
Right.
Oh,
And they grow up and you're like, what?
yeah. How are you 8 feet tall?
Yeah.
So,
Uh, I had one of those students that would strip. I would never forget. We're at a pep rally outside on the track,
of course you will.
and they were like, "You shouldn't bring him. It's too loud." Blah blah blah. I'm like, we're gonna bring him. It's gonna be fun. We're part of the school too,
Right, exactly.
so we go. It's going fine, and then out of the corner of my eye, she was with one of the aides, and obviously she wasn't paying attention, and she streaked across the field. And like 5 people down from me, superintendent, and he looks down at me, and I'm like, "What do you want me to do? I'm not gonna chase her." So then I get one of the aides, and they chase her down, and then it was it was a story from there on.
I mean, I get it. I absolutely get that when you get agitated,
Yeah,
you don't want to be bundled up in a bunch of clothes.
right. Good times. What about with parents and all the families you've worked with? Any stories on what they're doing with the child that's just awesome?
Yeah, I had to really think about that. The family that I sort of, unofficially help with right now with the kiddo with behavior challenges, they are doing everything right. Absolutely doing everything right. And the kid has benefited so much at home. And in fact, when he did finally get assessed by the school district just before kindergarten, that they put that in the report. The family has done everything right. They use gentle parenting. They are, they have a very calm, very consistent. They prevent. He's never more than arm's reach away from one of his parents if they're out in the public in a situation that might cause him to escalate and maybe act out. And so they're doing all the prevention, and they can read their kid like a book. So they're a very good example of they know the kids so much better than the
Mm-hmm.
IEPs do. You know, he's been in a couple of different classroom placements now with teachers who specialize in kids with behavior disorders, but they're nowhere near as successful as the family. And some of that is home is not school,
Right.
right? We can control the environment at home a little better. And we can control the environment at school because there's hundreds of kids on a school campus. And, there's only a handful of kids at home usually. So that's one family that I just feel like has it all, not all figured out, but they are really going to the nth degree to try to make this happen for their kiddo. And they're reaping the benefit of it at home, but they are still, having to have IEP meetings every month and that kind of thing. I had a mom of a kiddo student that I had who was, I think he was 16. He was medically involved, born with significant cognitive issues. This mom adopted him as an infant, knowing that he was really, really intensely involved. And he'd only been walking like a few years by the time I got him at 15, 16. And he wasn't yet toilet trained and nonverbal. But I learned from him, there's a kid in there no matter what you think. Like
Yeah.
he had very strong opinions about things. He found ways to express those opinions. A lot of the things that people who had worked with him before me found challenging, I loved about him because I figured out why he was doing those things, and a lot of them made sense to me. But that mom had done all of these things to expose him to everything she could. So she decorated his bedroom thematically and changed the theme every few weeks or so, every couple of months. So she would go all in on, under the sea or what have you. So his whole life was completely decked out in whatever the theme was. She had him out in the community all the time. She worked, this is when I worked up in Northern California. She worked with disabled kids. She had a therapeutic writing program that she sort of ran as a volunteer. So we would go and ride. I would take my class and we would go ride every Friday. But he had a adult sized tricycle because he's a big kid. He was a
Uh-huh.
regular size 15, 16-year-old. And he would be out there in the community with his respite care workers riding down to the market or wherever. Everybody in the community knew him. Like it was he just, I mean, he had the fullest life,
Yeah.
even though he had some pretty extreme limitations. So just a combination of things about that mom. She was so down to earth
Mm.
and she just knew him so well. Um, and she accepted him for who he was, but at the same time held very high expectations and just pushed him to go out there and live a life. Like she
Yeah.
wasn't pushing him to suddenly know calculus, but she was pushing him to live as full a life as he could. And that was just so fabulous. And because he was not a kid with autism, he was a kid with brain damage. He was, he had some facial deformity. I learned so much from that kid. And one of the first lessons that he taught me, he had fallen at home in the driveway and had scraped up a straight line down his face. And he kind of looked adorable. So I was trying to take a picture of him and he kept turning his face and snorting, like clearly annoyed that I'm trying to take his picture. And I'm like, you don't want me to take your picture when your face is scraped up. Like, wow, what an aha moment. He had a self-image that he cared about. He cared about how he looked. Like, wait, what? It never occurred to me that he might care about that. Like, it wasn't something I'd ever even considered. So it was just like, he taught me a million things the 2 years that I had him because there was so much going on inside him that looking at him and knowing his history, I would never have expected.
Yeah, they're capable of so much. It reminds me of a parent I know that they just never accepted that their kids got some pretty good autism. They're going to be on the podcast at some point, but they just never accepted that he had any limitations. And he has two younger brothers that are like full water polo, sports, everything. And so they just treated him the same as the other siblings. And he rose to the occasion.
It's really been my grandson's experience too. I think in part because his parents were not aligned in their approach necessarily. So he received a lot of special support at school, but at home, he was mostly like every other kid, particularly once he got past about age 6. We didn't have to facilitate things quite so much for him. When he was younger, he could have meltdowns. I can remember being at a Christmas tree lighting ceremony, and there were kids walking around with these really cool lit swords or some darn thing. And he wanted one, and we couldn't figure out where the vendor was. And so he had a big old meltdown in the middle of this thing. And they learned from that experience, oh, we got to take 2 cars when we go to things like this because we might have to leave. And he had an older sister who might not want to leave. And so it was, there was this whole thing. So I think that there is a lot to be said for that. What's interesting, I work with a family in one of the small districts that I work with where they had a big extended family group of friends and all of that. And they had a kid with pretty significant autism. He was verbal, but a lot of sensory issues, a lot of coping issues, that kind of thing. So social interaction really kind of needed to be on his own terms and much more easy for him with those folks that he'd known his whole life and that kind of thing. But in the school setting, he was very anxious. We had a lot of school avoidance. Mom didn't always understand, like, no, you got to make him go to school. Like she would, so there were difficulties. And it was, I think, the end of 8th grade, perhaps. He had been in a non-public school placement, in part because he lived in a very, very tiny district that didn't have options for kids with more significant or his kinds of needs. So he ended up in a non-public school placement, and they were going out into the community and they were doing pre-vocational, job exposure kinds of things. And he was always very, very anxious, and those things were always very challenging for him. And I had been telling the mom for years, he needs to come to school. He needs to get into the routine. He needs to be able to do these things because later in life, that's how life is. You have to interact with others. You have to be able to go to the grocery store. You have to be able to do these things or your life shrinks down very, very small. And she just kept saying, oh, we have this giant family. We have all these friends. He's fine. He's fine. He's fine. He does all the social activities. And then at the end of 8th grade, when he was largely incapable of going to the grocery store, like his world had receded down. He was doing less and less with the family, less and less with the family friends. And she said, you know what? I think you might have been right. Like it's a habit that you have to build and you have to expand and you have to push. And again, going back to that, he looks different than he does at home and in school. So she was worried then. She became worried then about, well, what's going to happen when he does leave? Is he just going to be home with us 24/7, 365 because he's not able, to like go into any kind of supported employment or anything like that? That might have been an option if we could have just built that muscle a little bit more to be out in the community and feel safe. But
It's such an emotional, fearful time. But thankfully, there are tons of resources available out there. SPED's come a long way.
Yes.
From the dark ages.
Thankfully.
Do you know any off the top of your head? Like where should parents start?
Here in California, we have California Regional Center. Not all states have an agency like that. A lot do. So California Regional Center is a state agency that provides support to individuals with disabilities from birth to death for certain disabilities, but for all kids under age 3. So in California, if you have a child who's not yet speaking and they're age 2, Regional Center would be who provided supports in combination with your insurance. If you don't have insurance, Regional Center will pay. If you have medical insurance, they're required to pay for any therapies that Regional Center basically assesses for and says they need. And then when kids leave at age 22, when they exit school services, or even if they graduate at the normal age, they continue to qualify for regional center services if they've qualified under one of those 5 categories. And I don't remember all 5 categories, but I can tell you autism is one, mental retardation or intellectual disability is one, epilepsy, seizure disorders is one, and I don't remember what the 5th one is. So they step back in and become the payer of first resort is what they call it. They're the primary agency for adults when they leave the school system. So supportive living situations, supported education, supported work, whatever it is, it all goes to regional center after age 22 here in California. Other than that, there are a gazillion support groups for all the different kinds of disabilities that kids get diagnosed with, whether it's autism, whether it's a specific rare genetic anomaly. You can Google those things and find the support groups. You have to sometimes take what they're offering with a grain of salt because sometimes those support groups for families have an agenda, whether it's we think all kids should be included in gen ed all day, every day, or we think they should not ever be included all day, every day, So you just have to find the group that most closely aligns with kind of your needs and take the parts that work for you and don't worry about the rest. I know my own kids chose never to affiliate themselves with any of the autism support groups because they just didn't want to have to weed through that. And truthfully, they didn't have time. They didn't want to make autism the center of their life. It's one of the things that I've noticed in my time working with students with autism is you have the one group of parents who become the head of the Autism Society and working at the state level to make changes. And, this becomes who they are. And then you have the folks that are completely like, autism, I don't even know what autism means, and then you have some folks in the middle. So yeah, there are extremes at both ends. And you have to do whatever fits for your family. I think connecting with other parents can be the strongest thing. It's scary for school districts to put parents together. So in a lot of the districts where I've worked, we have had autism parent groups where we get together, often in the evening and do some time to just hang out together and for the parents to really talk to one another. And then sometimes we as the district will have something to present, some sort of training or support or information or what have you. And that's terrifying to do as the district because parents in a need to get information will often compare notes. And what happens is people want what someone else has, but their kids are not the same. And so there can sometimes be this difficulty in navigating those conversations, as you know.
Yeah.
Uh,
Or they team up.
yeah. And, it's interesting that like the families that we had that sort of teamed up that year, they did and they didn't. They
Oh, yeah.
shared information, but they did not have the same expectations for each of them for each of their children. And so they weren't necessarily always wanting the same thing from us. Not like they banded together and said, you must do this for all of our kids. It was, I want this for my kid, but I want that for my kid. They banded together, but not so much. Which, that's kind of how you have to approach it in a lot of ways is, again, fight for what you think is right for your own individual kid and maybe simultaneously fight with other parents for the broad things that are maybe lacking in your district. And it might be the lack of parent involvement. It might be the lack of an overarching system of beliefs for your special ed department. What's your target? Where are you trying to get to? Because if you don't know that as a district, how can you know what to do day to day?
Mm-hmm.
So I think parents make us better. And in addition to all of the good stuff that's out there, there's a whole industry around supporting parents from professionals. So educational advocates, educational attorneys, those folks are expensive or can be. There are a few that are not so expensive. And sometimes they can be very adversarial in their approach, which I don't love, but they do make districts do better.
There's a couple notorious ones in this area.
Well, yeah, and they come and go, but there is some benefit sometimes. I have a family friend who consulted an attorney about a special ed issue for their child, and the attorney said, you're doing all the right things. Keep working with your IEP team. If you got to a point where the IEP team is not listening to you, call me back. So, there's an attorney I would probably give business to.
Yeah.
And then there's agencies and clinics and all kinds of folks out there providing therapies and training and supports, but those are not nonprofit folks. They are for-profit businesses. So I would tell parents to be very suspicious of those people. They may have something that's going to work for your kid. So we have in the autism community now, we didn't have them when I was teaching, but we have a whole set of reports that has now been revamped multiple times around evidence-based practices that have been proven through research to be effective for people with autism. And we have a whole matrix of what those evidence-based practices are, the EVPs, and what they're effective at addressing at what age level. So is it effective at addressing behavior? And if it is effective at addressing, so for example, ABA therapy, it's been proven through multiple, blind study research, peer reviewed, all of that stuff, studies to be effective in addressing behavior with kids in this age range, this age range, this age range. So it's this whole grid, it's a whole matrix. So we have that for autism therapies. And over the course of the 3 or 4 times that it's been renewed, therapies have been added because either they didn't exist at a prior iteration of the matrix, or there just wasn't enough evidence yet to prove that it was effective. So for example, picture exchange communication system, PECS, which we all live and die by and have for many, many years, didn't have enough independent research in the first 2 iterations of the matrix. Though we were all using it and knew it was effective, there just wasn't the research base to support it. So it didn't make the matrix as a recommended EVP. So there are now clinics and agencies providing some of those therapies and or some of the therapies that were looked at but didn't yet meet the criteria to make it onto the matrix. So there might be agencies out there providing, metronome or no feedback or what have you that might be effective for your kid. But you have no way of knowing that until you sign up. We have a classic example together. You and I worked with a family who had invested all the eggs in the basket of a private agency that was reporting to be providing educational services for kids with significant autism. It was a program that they had built and developed themselves for their own student, their own child, found it to be successful. So they'd gone out into the world and created a clinic and had other folks paying for them. And a previous district had agreed to pay for that therapy on behalf of the family. But by the time we inherited that student, the student was now a middle schooler, was still incapable of doing the most basic things. And that clinic would not provide any evidence, any records, examples of what their teaching strategies were. And the parents were very, very, very attached and to the owners of that clinic. And we felt much to the detriment of their own child. So you have to.
Yeah, that was a hard one.
It was a very hard one. And it was something that still kind of haunts me on behalf of that kid. But
yeah,
you just have to make sure that any clinic, any private company that you're going to work with, particularly if they're for profit, can provide you with data that shows what they're doing and how they're doing it. If they're keeping secrets from you, you don't want to do business with those folks, no matter what they're promising you, because there are no cures for any of the things in special ed. There are no cures.
There's just ways. People like, what do you teach? I said, when I was in the autism program, I said, I teach autism. I teach kids how to have autism. And they're like, what? Like, that's pretty much what we're doing. Just a different way to say it. Well, this has been an awesome conversation. I knew it was going to go long, but that's okay.
Yeah, good
and
luck.
We have it.
Yes, we could talk forever, and we haven't talked about IEPs. I will tell you that an IEP document is a work of art.
I was going to mention that we're going to have you back on and have just an IEP specific, because you are the guru of IEPs, and parents need to know what's going on these documents because they're thrown in front of them and they're expected to sign. And
which is criminal as far as I'm concerned, even as a school administrator, even working at the university now. I just think it's crazy that we are putting a 20, 30-page document in front of somebody and asking them to sign. It's not like they're buying a car.
In an hour and a half.
if you're lucky, an hour and a half. Sometimes it's even less. And the vast majority, 99% of parents sit there and say so little. So one of the
Hmm.
things that I counsel my student teachers on, just because part of my job is to observe them running an IEP meeting for a student that they've assessed and written the IEP for. And so always I give the feedback of, you need to get the parent more involved. How get the parent more involved? How can you get more information from the parent? Um, I think one of the ways that I avoided having a due process as a teacher was I learned early on with my little girl who had the brain damage and the burn. That mom taught me with a 2x4 upside my head that just sending home a draft of the IEP was not involving her. That if the words were already typed on the page, the IEP was done. And she's not wrong. She's not wrong. At the very least, that's the perception. Even though we go into the meeting and we'll make edits now that we have it electronically. At that time, we didn't even have them electronically. But so I learned from that feedback, part one, that I put in this process, and I worked in a mod severe program where there were 9 or 10 kids, right? So I had the ability to take a lot of time to write each IEP. So I started weeks ahead of the IEP. I had parents fill out questionnaires for me. What's your priority? What do you do at home? What do you need help with at home?
Hmm.
Because we're teaching everything in school, not just school things for kids in the mod severe world. We're teaching toothbrushing and hygiene and, all of that. So is there something at home you want him to be better at doing? And I would work with them on developing goals, and it would go back and forth for weeks so that by the time we got to the IEP meeting, my part was done.
Right.
We talked through what I thought were the logical next steps. We talked about what their priorities were. We wrote goals. They approved the goals before we ever got to the meeting, so that when we got to the meeting, we had time to talk about all the other stuff. And it might be we talk about their speech therapy or their occupational therapy, because that's the only time the parents get to talk to those folks, or whatever the other issues were. But we didn't have to talk about goals, because I had spent a whole lot of time working with that family so that I knew what the goals were and that they knew what the goals were.
And then you get to the goal part, and there's just like, yeah, I already know all those. Cool.
Yeah. We're good to go on that stuff.
Perfect. So if you're a parent out there and you're not getting a draft of the IEP, start asking for it.
You're entitled to a draft as soon as we get it done. The difficulty is, so this is sped admin. The difficulty is very often we are not getting them done until literally the morning of the IEP meeting, but we should be doing everything we can to get it to you in advance. At a minimum, we should be getting you the goals that are coming from the case manager. We often can't speed up the speech pathologist or the occupational therapist to get their goals into us any earlier, or their final report on progress on goals. But the goals that the case manager owns, you should get progress updates for those multiple times a year. So it shouldn't be a surprise. I will tell you that even in my own life, in middle school, we are not getting them consistently. Even with me being in the IEP team, we still are not getting them consistently. And then you should get a final progress report. The other just brief thing I'd say is that the IEP document is about connecting dots. So it starts with, what does your kid need? We assess in those areas of need. We figure out where they're functioning. We write goals to address for the deficits, and we write services that we believe will get your kid to reach the goals.
And then take tons of data.
Please. And take data that makes sense. And then, you know what? Don't just take the data, actually look at the data and analyze the data and use it to drive your instruction.
And then, but if you as a parent don't understand the data, it's probably not good.
The forms sometimes aren't super user friendly if we're using good behavior, like particularly around behavior data, because, we can get pretty far out in the weeds on getting behaviors and figuring out how we want to collect data on behaviors. So it isn't always super user friendly for a parent. But if there's something in the IEP that doesn't make sense to you, that doesn't sound like your kid, you need to have a conversation around that. You need to ask questions around that. I'm a strong advocate for working with your IEP team, because, again, we can't solve problems if we're arguing. We're not always going to agree, but we can find middle ground. So ask questions, figure out, why is your kid getting a goal that they've had before that they mastered? Or why did you write the goal in that way? Or, how are you going to measure what does success on this goal really look like? Because as teachers, sometimes we we get so nerdy on some of this stuff that it isn't
Yeah.
obvious really like what does success look like. And it helps if you can take the time to go and look at what are the general ed expectations for your kid's grade level. How much so like for mild moderate students at this point, we're using Lexile to measure reading ability. So if I'm sitting in an IEP meeting where the teacher is proposing to raise the child's Lexile in the next year 150 points, well, what's the expectation for typical kids and what's the expected growth? So if they're reading at a Lexile level of 300, and that's average for second grade, and we're talking about a fourth grader, now we're going to move that kiddo to 450 in the year that this goal exists in this IEP. And 450 is still only a second grade reading level. Well, we've lost ground. We spent a year on the calendar, but we didn't even move a year's worth of growth. We should be moving from second grade expectation to third grade expectation theoretically. And that's just to stay level. So
Yeah.
if you have time to go research those kinds of things, then you can make those arguments in the IEP meetings. And IEP teams are often absolutely willing to make those changes or to have those conversations. Sometimes we're writing those IEPs in isolation and we're not always thinking about the big picture.
I know for sure the first handful I wrote, I was a new teacher, so I didn't really know what was going on with those. But it was just like a shot in the dark. And then you get to the
Absolutely.
meeting and you're like, oh, that sounds good. Okay. I mean, that's what I see, but I have no idea what you want. And then they was just like, oh, it's good. But I didn't figure out till like, I don't know, the second year, like send home draft goals or call them and say, hey, what is the most annoying thing you do at home that you want to change?
Uh-huh.
Well, I remember one was just like, I just want my son to eat with his own fork.
Uh-huh.
Like, great. We can
We can
we
address
can
that.
change that.
I had a kiddo who lived in the country and he was a little bit of a wild thing. He was outside all the time and dad worked outside at the house. And so like, what's your concern? And he's like, I want to be sure that he knows not to touch snakes. We have rattlesnakes. I want to be sure. So we did a whole thing around
It's like,
responding to danger in general. That was the goal. It was a personal safety goal, but we got rubber snakes and we taught this kiddo to go get help, go get a grown up when you see a snake or when
yeah,
you see a fire or when like that made perfect sense to me. And, so it was practice, practice. The kid learned a rote response, but still we had a better shot at keeping him safe with that than with nothing. So,
yeah.
and I would never have hit upon that.
No, no chance.
No, I had the mom of my 15, 16-year-old that was out in the community so much. She just wanted him to be able to say mom. And he had some limited verbal abilities, so he was able to say mom. It took a little practice. And he was able to say mom, and we taught him to say mom to his mom. We got a photo, and, like we did a whole thing. And, like there was a small price to pay, and all learning is good learning.
Right.
So, yeah, if you're not asking those questions, how are you going to know
Yeah.
what to
And
focus?
then it all just plays into classroom management. And then if you don't know those things or have any kind of aim on what that student needs to accomplish, then you're doing things that they don't like or things that make it boring for them. And then behaviors come about and then
Yeah. The flip
disaster.
side to it, though, and it's something that I've had to battle all the time as a teacher and as a program specialist in terms of developing goals specifically, is I sometimes get parents who, a kiddo has a strength, an area of strength in math, let's say. And so they want to spend a lot of time in the IEP on developing math goals and having a lot of math goals because this is, where their kid has strength. And the problem is, as far as life outcomes go, and this is, something I learned by working with kids in the adult transition program and working with those adult support programs that take over at age 22 for folks who still need those kinds of supports. Whether or not you can do math doesn't matter. If you can't be out in the community appropriately, if you can't be safe out in the community, for adult day programs, it's a 3-to-1 ratio. If you can't
Oh,
be one of 3 clients with one instructor out in the community, then you have to be in a one-on-one program. And those are so much more restrictive. And they're kids that are very, very low functioning. And it's a little more of a bleak outcome. Like if you want your kid to have a full life, we need to shore up all of the social stuff. Thrilled that your kid has academic abilities and we're going to support those too. But I want to focus on the things that are really going to matter for your kid as an adult. Can they can they do tasks in an order that's set by someone else? Because that's sometimes a problem. So that they can get out there and they can actually work if they choose to want to do that. Because we know that adults with disabilities also want to have a purpose and also want to have a place they go each day to do something that's meaningful so that they're contributing. They actually have a sense of that and a strong sense of it for many of them. And their happiness is determined by having that. So we want to make sure that we're providing instruction in those sort of soft skills. You saw it working with the adult transition program. The
Mhm.
higher socially, the kids who could get by socially had many, many, many more options for how to spend their time.
Right.
So not honing in real hard on the academics and ignoring all of the rest of it, I think is another piece where I've had to do a lot of instruction with parents on why that needs to be a focus.
Yeah, that's kind of where I clashed with some parents because I was more on the life holistic side, not so much on academics. It
Independent, independent.
independent. I mean, that's the ultimate goal is to teach independence. That's what we're doing.
But I think the difference is we have the luxury of being able to look 6, 8, 10 years ahead. Parents do not have that luxury. Parents are trying to
Yeah.
do every single day, one day at a time for most of them. So they don't have the luxury to get to look ahead. So that was one of the things when I figured that out in like year 4, 3, that's when I
Hmm.
started doing the parent questionnaire at the beginning of the year and then prior to the IEP. Like I added a question. Where do you see your kid at age 25, at age 30? What are they doing? How are they communicating? Are they at home with you? Are they out in the community in a day program? Are they working independently? Are they married and have kids? Like what's your vision? What are you hoping?
Yeah,
And
that's
for
good.
most parents, they had not, when I taught elementary, they had not thought that far ahead because it's so hard to know. So it's like, well,
Yeah.
we're hoping for this. We're hoping for this, but where we think we might get to is somewhere maybe not quite
Yeah, it's just setting that intention and that getting clarity on what the path is.
and keeping your options open. So
Right.
like for my son's a very athletic guy, very sporty and really, really wanted, his son to play sports. His daughter does. And initially my grandson had no interest, zero, no interest whatsoever in organized sports. But as the neighborhood kids started to get more and more involved in sports, as he got a bit older and was maybe a little more socially aware of his space with kids. Like was always very socially adept, interacting with other kids. But once he felt that limitation, of, oh, I want to look like everybody else kind of a thing, he started to get a little bit more interested. And so we started off in not exactly one of the special ed challenger league sport things, but something sort of like that, very low key. And he did a couple seasons of baseball with that. And they were all very quirky kids and nobody had any actual skills. And this was like late elementary school. So that he had some success and enjoyed it. And then he was willing to give Little League a try. And so he started in a fall time, which is, Little Leagues bring up the newcomers sort of season. He played fall ball and then he played spring ball and started actually having some success and having some skills. And, now he plays travel baseball and he'll play high school baseball next year.
Not,
So, and it's like his first love, and he's
oh, well,
completely besotted with all things baseball at this point. But we had to start off really slow, and we had to wait for him to have that desire. That was something that was, I think, harder for my son than
yeah.
in-law. Uh, he would have liked to push him a little harder, but they learned pushing didn't get you anywhere. You kind of had to wait for him to initiate it. So staying in tune with those things.
Yeah. And sometimes it'll take somebody else coming alongside
Yeah.
and sparking that interest.
And keeping your options open and keeping your mind open to all possibilities. If he had suddenly had a strong interest in dancing ballet, I think we would have all still just jumped on just like we did for baseball, whatever he had become
Something.
interested in, because he'd always had these sort of perseverative interests, things that he would just focus on, and he would do that thing and only that thing for play for like a year and a half. So it was, WWE wrestling, or it was, various different things as a little kiddo. And we would all buy all the things and sit and play with him with all whatever things when he would let us. He mostly liked to play on his own, but just always encouraging whatever he was interested in. I'm trying to teach teachers to use that to their advantage as well.
Right.
You want to motivate him? Get a little DC character that's about this tall and
Right.
then work for that.
I started volunteering at church in one of the special needs class, and one of the kids loved Sonic. So right when I got home, I bought Sonic from Amazon, and the next Sunday I brought it to him, and he would never participate. The whole class on Sunday, he was participate because he had Sonic. And then everyone's like, "What did you do?" He just likes Sonic. Just do, the little things.
And I think that's the weirdest thing about being a SPED teacher is you don't know what tricks and tools are going to work until you try.
Yeah.
And sometimes there are things you would never come up with on your own. That's that going back to asking parents about what kids are into and, what motivates them and what have you. And what weird, quirky things. Like I had a kid that early on would perseverate on a certain word and would just say it over and over and over again all day long and drive us all crazy. That mentor
Chicken nugget.
was famous about all things autism, taught me two different strategies to address that. One is write it on the whiteboard, and every time you says it, you erase a letter, which is a little punitive, but you only ever really erase one letter because they never say it again. And or I had a student who years later, long after that mentor was gone, would get very nervous about the bus. Some days he would get on the bus and go home, and some days he would get on the bus and go to the babysitter's house. And one day they did it wrong and no one was home. And so he had anxiety from that from like a year prior. So when he would start asking that question about, is Delia going to pick you up on the bus and take you home? Is Delia going to pick you up on the bus and take you home 10,000 days, 10,000 times on a day? I would write it on a piece of paper. Delia is picking you up and taking you home, or Delia is picking you up and taking you to Carrie, whichever thing the bus was going to do. And he would put it in his pocket, and you could see him just like pat his pocket instead of asking the question. He just needed it to be concrete and reassuring. That is not a trick I would have figured out on my own. I have no idea how my mentor figured it out, but
Yeah.
for the kids it worked 100% of the time. It either worked or it didn't.
Uh-huh.
So trying to teach my student teachers some of those little tricks to try as they're working, and hoping I can, throw as many tools into their tool bag as possible before they leave me. That's the fun part of doing the university work.
Well, they're definitely fortunate to have you.
Thank you.
But before you go, I got one last question.
Okay.
What do you want all parents to know? I know here at UNspecial, we want all parents to know that they don't have to go about this journey alone. There is a space for them, and our goal is for them to be in community. And really the affirmation of you have what it takes. I know it may not seem like it sometimes, or it's never going to end, but you are equipped, you have what it takes. And so, what would you say?
I actually made notes, and we've talked about a lot of the notes that I made for like what I would really want parents to know.
Mm-hmm.
I think what you just said is really, really hits the nail on the head. It really does take a village. You really do, as uncomfortable as it is, have to be somewhat vulnerable and ask for help when you need help. Ask questions when you're in IEPs. Don't be afraid to be, that parent, as long as you're doing it nicely. We as teachers want to share our knowledge with you. I mean, that's people who become teachers are driven to share knowledge, right? That's why we're there. So ask as many questions as you want. Feel free to take up all the time. We may have to limit how much time we can spend with you at a time, and certainly not during the school day, but ask as many questions as you have. And if the teacher can't answer, then whoever's next up on the chain can.
Mm-hmm.
So be willing to open yourself up to that. The parent that made the district change that you and I shared She was exactly that kind of parent. She asked millions of questions and she made sure she understood the answers before she would, leave the room. And I have a lot of respect for folks who have that kind of focus and that willingness to put their kids' needs first above what we've all been taught about being polite and respectful and not asking too many questions. Like a lot of us, defer. Like, oh, I'm not going to ask. I already asked 3 questions. I don't want to ask any more questions. I don't want to be that parent. So sometimes you have to overcome your own discomfort in order to be a good advocate for your kid. And that's hard. We're taught to be polite. We're taught to be respectful. So if you don't understand what's happening, don't give up until you understand.
Yeah.
Keep asking the questions. Keep asking for help. Ask your school who can help you with your home situation. Very often we know sometimes who the good agencies are out there in terms of like in-home therapy, that kind of thing. We do overlap with them sometimes. And so we know from other parents who's good and who's not. We know who the dentist is that will work with a kid with autism or who the barber is that will work with a kid with autism because we hear that from other parents.
Well,
so don't be afraid to ask, even if it seems like something that we might not know. And don't be afraid to ask for goals that are going to be meaningful to you in your home life just because it's school.
yeah, that's good. Well,
There's
Robin,
not a fine line between us and home anymore when we're talking about these kinds of kids.
no. Well, you've dropped so much wisdom, which I fully expected, and so thankful to have you on the show. We'll be in touch. Probably.
Are you doing 4-hour podcast episodes?
I don't know. We might break this up into a couple parts, but I am interested in having you back on for some IEP knowledge, and this is just kind of a walkthrough on that. And I also want to pick your brain on an idea of in-home services, but a online module that parents can use and follow.
So I will tell you that, and it's not something we got to, but in that matrix of EVPs for autism, evidence-based practices, there is a group, I don't even remember how it all got started, but they created modules to teach both teachers and families how to do a lot of those evidence-based practices. So they are online modules that people can access. It's through Affirm AF. So they're teaching ABA therapy, teaching you how to do like picture exchange if you wanted to go all in on that, which is complicated. Just pivotal response therapies, different differential reinforcement, like some of the more clinical kinds of instruction, as well as just like peer mediated intervention, how you get peers to work with your kid instead of adults, because that's another thing that's really unnatural in in-home services is you're paying people to come and play with your kid. And even when it's adult services, you're paying people to be your kid's roommate or your kid's friend at work.
Right.
Which is really unnatural. So yeah, anyway, so there is the Affirm modules aren't always user-friendly for parents, but they do exist.
I'll check those out and then maybe come out with my own.
Yeah, I think that
with my own twist. Street sped.
I think that there's a need for something less clinical.
Yeah.
So like, because of the SELPA that I worked in, we provided tons and tons of trainings all the time. And a lot of those trainings are actually targeted to parents. I've done some pretty extensive prompting training on how not to build prompt dependence in your child. Because that's a very tricky, subtle sort of thing. It would look different and did look different when I was doing the prompting training for teachers, when I was doing the prompting training for aides, and when I was doing prompting trainings for parents, because we need different things in different environments. So the Affirm modules are really targeted and created for educators, but they're available to parents. So I think there is still a need to take some of that information and synthesize it down in a way that is more approachable for parents and more meaningful in a home environment or a community environment rather than in a clinic or a school setting. So you're still feeling it.
Yeah, I'll check that out. This sounds good. Thanks. We'll be in touch. Appreciate it. Thanks for watching another episode of the UNspecial podcast. Make sure to like, subscribe, and share. You can find us at UNspecial LLC on Instagram, unspecialllc.com, and we would love to hear your feedback and have you on the show. Thanks again.